I almost flew back to America less than 24 hours after arriving in Cebu. The airline's website was already open on my laptop. My passport sat beside a cup of coffee that had gone completely cold. All I had to do was press one button, book flight. That was it. After nearly 7,000 miles, after selling the house I had called home for 36 years, after packing everything I still wanted to keep into 2 blue suitcases, I was ready to give up before my first full day in the Philippines had even ended. The apartment wasn't anything special. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a little balcony overlooking a busy street where motorcycles never seemed to stop passing by. The air conditioner rattled every few minutes, almost as if it were reminding me it had already lived a long life before I moved in. It was clean, safe, and at 28,000 pesos a month, it was exactly what I had budgeted for before leaving Oregon. I'd spent months creating spreadsheets: rent, utilities, groceries, healthcare, even setting aside money for visa extensions because I didn't want any surprises. On paper, everything made sense. Reality felt very different. I remember standing on that balcony just after sunset. The warm air felt heavy compared to the cool evenings I was used to back home. Someone nearby was grilling food. Children were laughing somewhere below. A dog barked in the distance. Life was happening all around me, yet I'd never felt more alone. I kept asking myself the same question: what have I done? Most women my age were planning family vacations, babysitting grandchildren, joining gardening clubs, talking about retirement cruises. I had divorced my husband after 42 years of marriage, sold almost everything we owned, walked away from the only routine I'd known for most of my adult life, and somehow I ended up here, alone, on an island I'd only seen through travel videos and late-night internet searches. Whenever people hear my story, they usually ask the same question: why the Philippines? It's a fair question, but it isn't the one that matters most. The better question is this: how does a 70-year-old woman who spent more than 4 decades building one life find the courage to start an entirely different one? The answer doesn't begin in Cebu. It begins on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Oregon, when my husband quietly said 7 words that changed everything. I don't think we're happy anymore. My husband didn't leave me for someone else. There wasn't a dramatic argument, no slammed doors, no lawyers fighting over every piece of furniture we'd collected through the years. If I'm being honest, I almost wish there had been, because anger is easier to understand than silence. For a long time, our marriage looked perfectly normal from the outside. We raised 2 wonderful boys, never missed birthdays, cheered at soccer games, celebrated anniversaries, took road trips every summer, built the kind of life we once dreamed about when we were young. Then life quietly changed. The boys grew up, college came and went, the bedrooms upstairs slowly became storage rooms, our grandchildren arrived, I retired after 38 years of teaching 2nd grade. A year later, he retired too. Everyone kept telling us how wonderful retirement would be. Now you'll finally have time together. We believed them at first. Looking back, I don't think retirement changed us. I think it simply removed all the distractions that had kept us from noticing how much we'd already changed. For decades, our schedules had carried the marriage. Work, bills, school events, family dinners, weekend projects. There was always another responsibility waiting. Then one day, there wasn't. I started reading more, walking every morning, volunteering twice a week at the public library. He spent hours in the garage, watched television late into the night, started taking long drives without telling me where he was going. Neither of us was doing anything wrong. We were simply living separate lives inside the same house. One Tuesday afternoon, I made grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch. It sounds strange now, how clearly I remember something so ordinary. The soup was tomato, the bread had toasted a little too long. I can still picture the sunlight coming through the kitchen window onto the table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together. He barely touched his food. Instead, he looked down at his hands. And after what felt like forever, he quietly said, "I don't think we're happy anymore." I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, because deep down, I already knew he was right. That was the moment I realized something I never thought I'd have to face at 70 years old. Sometimes, a marriage doesn't end because two people stop loving each other. Sometimes, it ends because they slowly become strangers, and neither of them notices, until the silence becomes louder than the conversation. The divorce wasn't final for another 8 months. Those 8 months changed me in ways I never expected. Not because I was preparing to lose my husband, but because I was about to discover something I'd forgotten existed. Myself. People imagine divorce happens the day the papers are signed. It doesn't. At least it didn't for me. For us, it happened one small goodbye at a time. The first thing to disappear wasn't the house. It was our routines. We stopped eating dinner together, stopped asking each other what we wanted from the grocery store, stopped making plans for weekends. We were still sharing the same address, but it no longer felt like we were sharing a life. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the guest bedroom with an empty cardboard box. I wasn't even sure what I was packing. Old photo albums, Christmas decorations, school projects my boys had made when they were 7 or 8 years old, a ceramic coffee mug that one of my students had painted for me nearly 20 years earlier. It had my name written across the front in uneven blue letters, Mrs. Matthews. I held that mug longer than I should have. Somehow, it represented an entire lifetime. I decided it was coming with me, wherever with me eventually turned out to be. Friends tried to help. Some suggested I move closer to one of my sons. Others thought a retirement community would be perfect. One neighbor handed me a brochure for a beautiful senior living complex just outside Salem. The apartment started at nearly $3,400 a month. I remember looking at the monthly price more than the photographs. Not because I couldn't afford it, but because I couldn't imagine paying that much to begin a life that didn't feel like mine. For the first time in decades, every decision belonged to me. That sounds exciting. It wasn't. It was terrifying. When you've spent 42 years asking, "What do you think?" you almost forget how to ask yourself, "What do I want?" The house sold faster than I expected. A young couple walked through during the second showing. They loved the backyard, talked about where they wanted to put a swing set someday. I smiled the entire time they were there. Then I cried in my car before I even started the engine. Not because I regretted selling it, because I suddenly understood our chapter inside those walls was really over. After closing costs and everything else was finished, I rolled part of the money into retirement savings and kept enough accessible to give myself options. For the first time since I was in my 20s, my future wasn't already planned. It was blank. And if I'm being honest, blank pages can be frightening. They can also become the beginning of an entirely different story. A few weeks later, my oldest son invited me over for dinner. I almost didn't go. Something told me he wanted to talk me out of whatever he suspected I was planning. The conversation that night stayed with me for a very long time, because it forced me to answer a question I hadn't even asked myself yet. My oldest son invited me over for dinner about 3 weeks after the house sold. His wife made lasagna. The grandchildren were running through the backyard, chasing each other with water balloons. For a few hours, everything almost felt normal. I smiled, laughed, helped clear the dishes. You would have thought nothing had changed. But when dinner was over, he asked if we could sit outside for a minute. I knew that tone. Children never stop being your children, even after they're adults. He waited until the kids went inside before speaking. "Mom, you've been different lately." I looked at him. "I suppose that's bound to happen after a divorce." He smiled, but only for a second. "No, it's more than that. You almost seem," he searched for the right word, "restless." That surprised me, because I hadn't told anyone what I'd been thinking, not even myself. Then he asked the question everyone else would eventually ask. "Why don't you just move closer to us?" It was a reasonable question. They lived less than 2 hours away. I could have bought a smaller home, seen the grandkids every weekend, started over somewhere familiar. I wanted that. Part of me really did. But another part, the part I had ignored for most of my adult life, wanted something else, something I couldn't explain. "I don't think I need a smaller house. I think I need a different life." The words surprised both of us. I hadn't planned on saying them. They simply came out. He looked down at his hands for a long moment. "I just don't want you to be lonely." Neither did I. That's what frightened me the most, not living alone, living the next 20 years exactly the same as the last 20. Driving home that evening, I realized something. For weeks, everyone had been trying to help me rebuild the life I'd lost. No one had asked whether I wanted to build something entirely new. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, instead of lying there staring at the ceiling, I opened my laptop. I didn't know what I was looking for. Retirement ideas, places to live, small towns, beach communities. Somehow, one video led to another. Portugal, Costa Rica, Mexico, Panama. I watched them all. They were beautiful, but none of them stayed with me. Then a thumbnail appeared that I'd never expected to click. It simply said, "Retiring in Cebu at 68." I almost kept scrolling. Something told me to watch it anyway. I had no idea that one click was about to change the direction of the rest of my life. I expected to watch that video for 5 minutes. Instead, I watched the entire thing. Then another, then another. Before I realized it, it was almost 3 o'clock in the morning. There wasn't anything flashy about the videos. No dramatic music, no promises that life would suddenly become perfect. Just ordinary people. Retired teachers, former nurses, a widower from Arizona, a couple from Canada. They weren't talking about escaping life. They were talking about finally slowing down enough to enjoy it. That caught my attention. One woman said something that stayed with me for days. She smiled into the camera and said, "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm actually living instead of simply getting older." I replayed that sentence 3 times, not because I wanted to move to the Philippines, because I wanted to feel that way again. The next morning, instead of making coffee, I opened my laptop. I started taking notes, not dreams, numbers, always numbers, old habits from 38 years of teaching. If I was going to consider something this big, I needed to understand it. One notebook quickly became 3. One page was simply titled Monthly Budget. Rent, food, utilities, health insurance, transportation, visa costs, emergency savings, everything I could think of. I estimated that I was spending nearly $4,300 a month living comfortably in Oregon after the divorce. Not struggling, just living. The more I researched, the more surprised I became. Many retirees in Cebu seem to be living comfortably on somewhere between $1,800 and $2,500 a month, depending on their lifestyle. That wasn't the reason I kept watching, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't make me curious. One afternoon, I stumbled across a video showing an ordinary one-bedroom apartment in Cebu City. Nothing luxurious, white tile floors, simple furniture, a small balcony. The monthly rent was listed as 30,000 pesos. I remember pulling out my calculator. Roughly $500. I checked the numbers 3 different times because I assumed I'd made a mistake. Back home, I'd paid more than that some months just to keep the lights on, the property taxes current, and the yard maintained. I wasn't chasing cheaper living. I was chasing lighter living. There's a difference. The more I watched, the more something unexpected started happening. Instead of wondering, could I move there? I started asking, what's stopping me? That question frightened me, because for the first time, I couldn't come up with a very good answer. A week later, I walked into my local passport office. Not because I'd decided to leave, because I wanted the option. That's what I told myself anyway, just the option. Funny how life changes. Sometimes the biggest decisions begin disguised as the smallest ones. There was still one person I hadn't talked to, my younger son, and his reaction was nothing like I expected. I expected my younger son to try and talk me out of it. Instead, he surprised me. We met at a small coffee shop halfway between our homes, the same place we'd met dozens of times over the years. He arrived first. 2 coffees were already waiting on the table. He looked at me for a long moment before saying, "So, I hear you've been researching the Philippines." I laughed. "I guess your brother told you." He did. Another quiet moment passed. Then he asked something I hadn't expected. "Are you actually thinking about moving?" I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup before answering. "I don't know. Maybe." I searched for the right words. I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd been a little braver. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he nodded, then smiled. "You know, when I was a kid, you were always the one telling us to try new things. Don't be afraid. Take the chance. Learn something different." He laughed quietly. "Maybe it's your turn." I felt tears building before I even realized they were there. Not because he'd convinced me to go, because for the first time, someone wasn't trying to convince me to stay. That conversation changed everything. It didn't make the decision easier. It simply made it feel possible. Over the next month, my notebook became thicker. I wasn't just watching videos anymore. I was researching everything. How long could I legally stay? How did healthcare work? Could I rent instead of buying? What happened if I decided 6 months later that I'd made a mistake? Every answer led to another question. Oddly enough, that gave me comfort. The more I learned, the less impossible it all seemed. One evening, I discovered that visitors could initially enter the Philippines and, if they wanted to stay longer, apply for extensions instead of committing to a permanent move right away. That changed my thinking completely. I didn't have to decide where I'd spend the rest of my life. I only had to decide whether I was willing to spend a few months discovering something new. That felt manageable. Teachers have a habit of turning everything into homework. I was no different. I made spreadsheets, compared airline prices, read apartment listings, estimated grocery costs, calculated exchange rates, even added a column titled, "What if I hate it?" Seeing those words on paper made me laugh, because for every worst-case scenario I imagined, I also had to admit something else. What if I loved it? That question stayed with me for weeks. Eventually, it became impossible to ignore. So one rainy Thursday morning, I walked into a travel agency. Not to buy a ticket. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I only wanted information. Funny how often life changes, the moment we convince ourselves we're just looking. 3 days later, I walked back out holding something that made everything suddenly feel real. A printed itinerary. Oregon to Cebu. I spent my last night in Oregon sleeping on an air mattress. The movers had already taken everything else. The house echoed in a way I'd never heard before. Every footstep sounded unfamiliar. I woke up just before sunrise. For a few seconds, I forgot everything that had happened. Then I looked around. Bare walls, empty rooms, 2 blue suitcases waiting beside the front door. Reality returned all at once. I made coffee one last time, not because I wanted it, because I'd made coffee in that kitchen almost every morning for 36 years. Some habits deserve a proper goodbye. I drank it standing at the window over the sink, the same window where I'd watched my boys wait for the school bus, the same window where I'd watched my husband mow the lawn every Saturday morning, the same window where we'd planned vacations, worried about bills, celebrated promotions, and imagined retirement would look very different than it eventually did. When the coffee was gone, I carried the mug to one of my suitcases, the little ceramic mug my student had painted years ago. It almost didn't fit. I wrapped it inside a sweater and gently zipped the suitcase closed. Some things aren't valuable because they're expensive. They're valuable because they remind you who you've been. Before leaving, I walked through every room one last time. The living room, the hallway, the bedrooms, the garage. I wasn't looking for forgotten belongings. I was collecting memories. In the hallway, I stopped in front of a door frame. Small pencil marks still covered the trim. 1996, 1997, 1998. Each line measured another inch one of my boys had grown. I smiled without realizing it. Then I reached out and gently ran my fingers across those little marks. No one else would probably notice them. To me, they were priceless. The wedding ring was still on my finger. I hadn't thought much about it, not until that morning. I turned it slowly, slid it off, held it in the palm of my hand. There wasn't any anger, no resentment, only gratitude. 42 years had given me 2 incredible sons, beautiful grandchildren, and a lifetime of memories. Even if the marriage had ended, those things hadn't. I placed the ring inside the small zippered pocket of my purse, not because I wanted to forget, because I finally understood I didn't need to wear my past to carry it with me. Before locking the front door, I looked around one final time. An empty house, but not an empty life. Those are 2 very different things. I pulled the door shut, turned the key, listened to the lock click into place. Then I stood there for a few seconds, holding the key in my hand. I realized I wasn't crying because I was leaving. I was crying because I had loved this place enough to miss it. And somehow that made leaving a little easier. My oldest son drove me to the airport. Neither of us talked very much. Sometimes silence says everything. When we reached the departure curb, he unloaded my 2 blue suitcases, closed the trunk, walked over, and hugged me tighter than he ever had before. Then he quietly said, "Promise me one thing." I smiled. What? "If this place makes you happy, don't come home just because everyone expects you to." I looked at him for a second. The son who had once asked me why I couldn't simply move closer. The son who had worried I'd be lonely. Now he wasn't asking me to stay. He was giving me permission to live. As the automatic airport doors opened, I took one last look back. Not because I wanted to change my mind, because I wanted to remember exactly how it felt the moment my second chapter finally began. The flight felt endless. Portland, Seattle, then across the Pacific. Hours blurred together somewhere over the ocean. Movies played that I barely watched. Meals came and went. I slept in short bursts, waking every couple of hours, wondering where in the world I was. Every now and then, I'd unzip the small pocket of my purse just enough to make sure my passport was still there. Old habits. When the captain finally announced our descent into Cebu, I looked out the window. The first thing I noticed wasn't the city. It was the water. Bright blue, scattered islands, little boats leaving white trails behind them. It looked nothing like Oregon. As soon as the aircraft door opened, I felt the heat. Not uncomfortable, just different. Warm, humid. The kind of air that lets you know you've arrived somewhere tropical before you even step inside the terminal. The airport was busy. Families hugging, taxi drivers waiting, people speaking English, others speaking Cebuano. Everything felt unfamiliar, yet strangely welcoming. I remember standing there for a moment, holding onto the handle of one blue suitcase, watching people rush past me. Nobody knew who I was. Nobody knew why I'd come. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't somebody's wife. I wasn't Mrs. Matthews, the teacher. I wasn't Linda from Oregon. I was simply someone beginning again. The first thing I did wasn't find a taxi. It was visit the ATM. I'd already notified my bank before leaving home. Even so, my heart raced the first time I inserted my card. What if it didn't work? It did. A few seconds later, the machine counted out crisp Philippine pesos. I remember smiling at something so ordinary, because every little thing that worked felt like another reason to believe I'd made the right decision. Outside the terminal, I ignored the first few people offering rides, not because they weren't friendly, because I'd promised myself I'd slow down and think before making decisions. Eventually, I found the official airport taxi line. The driver loaded my luggage into the trunk. He smiled through the open window. "Cebu City, ma'am?" I nodded. He switched on the meter without me even asking. That tiny gesture immediately put me at ease. The ride into the city cost a little under 500 pesos. Watching the meter climb was strangely comforting. I'd spent weeks reading stories online about transportation. Now I wasn't reading anymore. I was living it. The streets were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Motorcycles seemed to appear from every direction. Jeepneys painted in bright colors rolled past every few minutes. Street vendors stood beneath colorful umbrellas selling fruit, grilled chicken, and bottled water. At one intersection, I noticed 3 school children laughing so hard they could barely cross the street. Life felt busy, loud, completely alive. About 40 minutes later, the taxi turned into a quieter neighborhood. Small cafes, corner stores, a laundry shop, a bakery. Nothing fancy, just ordinary life. Exactly what I had hoped to find. The driver pulled up outside a modest apartment building. I paid the fare, added a small tip, then stood there for a moment, looking up at the place that would become my home. 1 bedroom, small balcony, air conditioning, furnished, 28,000 pesos a month. It wasn't luxurious. It didn't need to be. For the first time in nearly a year, I had a place that belonged only to me. I picked up my 2 blue suitcases, walked through the front entrance, and quietly whispered something to myself that I hadn't believed was possible only a few months earlier. I made it. I had no idea that before the sun went down, I'd come dangerously close to booking a flight back to America. The apartment looked exactly like the pictures. That was a relief. No unpleasant surprises, no hidden problems, just a simple 1-bedroom apartment with white tile floors, a small dining table, a sofa, and a balcony overlooking the street. The property manager handed me 2 keys, showed me how to lock the door, pointed toward the air conditioner remote, then smiled. "If you need anything, just send me a message." A few minutes later, I was alone. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, there was complete silence. At least, silence inside the apartment. Outside was another story. Motorcycles, dogs barking somewhere in the distance, people laughing, music drifting through an open window. It wasn't loud, just different. Every sound reminded me I was very far from home. I unpacked slowly. The notebook went into the kitchen drawer. The teacher's mug found a place beside the sink. My clothes filled barely half the closet. The 2 blue suitcases suddenly looked much bigger now that everything was out of them. They had carried my entire life across the Pacific. Now they sat quietly in the corner, empty. I opened the refrigerator. A bottle of water. Nothing else. I'd forgotten to stop at the grocery store. I laughed to myself. My very first night in my new home, and I didn't even have anything for breakfast. It was such a small mistake, yet somehow it made everything feel overwhelming. Jet lag finally caught up with me. I sat down on the edge of the bed, pulled out my phone. The time back in Oregon made no sense anymore. My sons were asleep. My grandchildren were asleep. The people I'd spent my whole life with were living an ordinary Tuesday, while I was sitting alone in a country where I didn't know a single person. That realization hit me harder than I expected. I walked onto the balcony. The evening air was still warm. Across the street, a family was eating dinner together on their porch. Someone laughed. A little girl chased what looked like her older brother around a parked motorcycle. For a moment, I wasn't watching strangers. I was seeing everything I'd left behind. I went back inside, opened my laptop, logged into the airline website, typed in Cebu to Portland. The flights appeared almost instantly. One connection, then another. I stared at the screen. My finger rested on the trackpad. All I had to do was click. The same button I'd talked about at the beginning of this story. Book flight. I remember thinking, no one would blame me. My family would understand. My friends would probably feel relieved. I could tell everyone, I tried. Maybe that's enough. Maybe 70-year-old women aren't supposed to start over 7,000 miles from home. Maybe everyone had been right all along. Then something caught my eye. Not on the screen, on the chair beside the bed. The little ceramic mug, the one my student had painted all those years ago. Mrs. Matthews. I smiled through tears. That mug had followed me across an ocean. Not because it was useful, because it reminded me of who I had always been. Someone who spent nearly 4 decades telling children not to be afraid of trying something new. Someone who believed mistakes were part of learning. Someone who always said, "You'll never know what you're capable of if you quit on the first day." I closed the laptop. Not because I suddenly felt brave, because I realized something. I'd promised myself one thing before leaving Oregon. No matter how frightened I became, I owed this new life more than 24 hours. 1 week. That was the promise. Stay 1 week. If I still wanted to leave, I could leave knowing I'd given myself an honest chance. I looked out over the lights of Cebu one more time. The city hadn't changed. I had. Just a little. Enough to make one more decision. Tomorrow, I would go outside. I would buy groceries. I would walk the neighborhood. And I would see what kind of life might be waiting for me if I stayed. The next morning, I kept the promise I'd made to myself. Just 1 week. I wasn't going to decide the rest of my life before I'd even bought breakfast. I showered, made the bed, straightened the apartment for absolutely no reason. Old habits have a funny way of following you around the world. Then I picked up my notebook. At the top of the page, I wrote 3 simple goals. Buy groceries, walk the neighborhood, don't hide inside. I figured if I could accomplish those 3 things, the day would be a success. The grocery store was only about a 10-minute walk away. I could have taken a ride. Instead, I wanted to feel the neighborhood. The sidewalks weren't perfect. Motorcycles passed every few seconds. Small convenience stores seemed to appear on every corner. Someone was grilling pork over charcoal. A woman smiled as she swept the front of her tiny shop. 2 little boys kicked a worn-out basketball back and forth in the street. Everything felt busy, but nobody seemed to be in a hurry. Inside the grocery store, I wandered much longer than I needed to. Some brands looked familiar, others I'd never seen before. I stood in front of the coffee aisle for nearly 5 minutes trying to decide what to buy. Eventually, I laughed at myself. It wasn't really about the coffee. It was about realizing I was building a completely new routine, one small decision at a time. My shopping basket wasn't very exciting. Fresh fruit, eggs, bread, rice, chicken, coffee, a few bottles of water, enough to get through several days. When the cashier handed me the receipt, I looked down almost automatically. Just under 1,900 pesos. I quietly converted it in my head. Less than I'd expected. Not unbelievably cheap, just reasonable. That word stayed with me. Reasonable. Life suddenly felt manageable. On the walk back, I noticed a little bakery I'd somehow missed earlier. The smell pulled me inside before I even realized I'd changed direction. The woman behind the counter smiled. "Good morning." I smiled back. "Good morning." I pointed at something that looked like a sweet bread roll. She placed 2 into a paper bag. I reached into my wallet. She looked at me and said, "Only 38 pesos, ma'am." I almost asked if she'd forgotten to charge me for the second one. She hadn't. I carried those warm bread rolls all the way back to the apartment, not because they were the best thing I'd ever eaten, because they were the first purchase that truly felt like it belonged to my new life. Later that afternoon, I carried a chair onto the little balcony, coffee in my teacher's mug, fresh bread from the bakery, traffic moving steadily below. The same street that had frightened me the night before looked completely different in daylight. Children waved at neighbors. People stopped to chat outside small stores. Someone across the street watered potted plants while humming quietly to themselves. Nothing extraordinary was happening, yet I realized I wasn't thinking about booking a flight anymore. I was wondering where the bakery got those bread rolls. That tiny thought made me smile, because somewhere between the grocery store, the walk, and a paper bag that cost less than $1, fear had quietly given up a little ground. Hope had taken its place. I still missed my family. That hadn't changed. But something else hadn't changed either. The promise I'd made to myself. 1 week. For the first time, I started believing I might actually stay that long. By the 4th morning, I realized I wasn't checking the airline website anymore. That surprised me. Not because I suddenly knew I was staying forever, because I'd stopped counting the days. Instead of wondering what I was missing back home, I had started paying attention to what was happening right in front of me. The woman sweeping outside the little convenience store always waved when I walked by. The security guard at my apartment smiled every morning and greeted me with the same cheerful, "Good morning, ma'am." At first I thought he was simply being polite. Then one morning, he looked up from his desk before I even reached the door. "Morning, Miss Linda." I actually stopped walking. He remembered my name. Such a tiny thing, yet after months of feeling like I'd lost part of my identity, he had unknowingly given a piece of it back. The little bakery became part of my routine, too. Every other morning, I'd stop in for coffee and one of those warm bread rolls I'd grown to love. One day, I reached for my wallet. The woman behind the counter smiled and quietly placed the same order into a paper bag before I'd even spoken. "You like this one," she laughed. "I remember." I laughed too. Apparently, I had become predictable. Somehow, that felt comforting. It wasn't just the bakery. The fruit stand owner started pointing out which mangoes were sweetest that day. A young cashier patiently waited while I counted pesos a little too slowly. One afternoon, I accidentally thanked someone in Cebuano. The pronunciation was terrible. Everyone laughed, including me. No one made me feel embarrassed. Instead, an older gentleman standing nearby gently repeated the word until I said it correctly. Then he gave me a thumbs up before walking away. Little moments, that's all they were, little moments. Yet they slowly added up to something much bigger. Back in Oregon, I had spent months feeling invisible. Not because people were unkind, because everyone already knew exactly who I was supposed to be. Teacher, wife, mother, grandmother. Here, no one expected me to be anyone except myself. There was something incredibly freeing about that. About a week after arriving, I bought a small potted plant for the apartment. It cost only a couple hundred pesos, nothing expensive, just a little green plant sitting outside a neighborhood shop. I carried it home like it was something precious. Then I placed it on the balcony beside my chair. The apartment instantly felt different. Not rented, lived in. That afternoon, I finally slid the 2 blue suitcases underneath the bed. They'd been sitting in the corner since the day I arrived. Part of me had left them there on purpose, just in case. Just in case I changed my mind. Just in case I decided to leave. I stood there looking at the empty corner for a long moment. Then I smiled. Without realizing it, I'd unpacked more than my clothes. I'd unpacked my fear. The notebook came back out that evening, not to calculate expenses, not to compare budgets. Instead, I wrote something across an empty page. The first sentence I'd written that wasn't about planning. Maybe home isn't always the place you came from. I stared at those words for several minutes. Then I closed the notebook. Because for the first time since stepping off that airplane, I didn't need another spreadsheet. I needed another sunrise. The following week, I found myself standing outside the Bureau of Immigration. Not because I had to, because I'd already made a decision. I wasn't ready to leave. I wanted to stay a little longer. Walking into the Bureau of Immigration felt strangely familiar. Not because I'd ever been there before, because government offices seem to look the same no matter where you are in the world. People waiting patiently, forms to fill out, quiet conversations, numbers being called. I'd spent far more time worrying about it than I needed to. The process wasn't instant, but it also wasn't nearly as complicated as I'd imagined. A few forms, a passport, the required fees, some waiting, then it was done. I walked back outside holding my passport. I smiled without even realizing it. Not because of the stamp, because that little stamp represented a decision I'd finally made. I wasn't extending a visa, I was extending a chance. On the walk home, I stopped by the bakery. Without asking, the woman behind the counter placed 2 warm bread rolls into a paper bag. "You'll need coffee, too," she said with a smile. I laughed. "I think you're probably right." For the first time, someone else had started assuming I'd be back tomorrow. Somehow, that meant more than she probably realized. That evening, my phone rang. It was my oldest son. We talked about ordinary things at first, the weather, the grandchildren, how school was going for the oldest, whether I'd figured out the washing machine yet. I admitted I was still pressing buttons and hoping for the best. He laughed. "So, how are you really doing?" I looked out toward the balcony before answering. The little plant I'd bought was moving gently in the breeze. Motorcycles rolled past below. Someone nearby was playing music. It all sounded normal now. I paused. I think I'm beginning to settle in. There was silence for a moment. Then he quietly said something I'll never forget. "Mom, you sound different." "What do you mean?" "You sound," he hesitated, "lighter. Not happier, not excited, lighter. As though something I'd been carrying for years had finally become small enough to put down." I didn't know what to say, because he was right. The sadness hadn't disappeared. I still missed my family every single day. I still wished my marriage had ended differently. I still had moments when Oregon felt very far away. But those feelings no longer filled every corner of my life. There was room for something else now. Curiosity, peace, possibility. Before we hung up, my youngest granddaughter asked if she could say hello. Her tiny voice came through the speaker. "Grandma, when are we coming to your house?" I smiled, not because I had an answer, because she'd called it my house. Not my apartment, not the Philippines, my house. Children have a wonderful way of accepting change long before adults do. After the call ended, I carried my coffee out onto the balcony. The city lights stretched across the evening. I thought about the woman who had stood on that same balcony only days earlier, ready to buy a ticket home. She felt like someone I still knew, but no longer someone I wanted to become again. I reached under the bed and pulled out one of the blue suitcases. Not because I was packing, because there was something inside I'd forgotten. The small framed family photo. I placed it on the bookshelf beside the teacher's mug. Then I slid the suitcase back underneath the bed. This time, I didn't leave it where I could grab it quickly. I pushed it all the way against the wall. Just in case. Not because I might leave. Because I finally believed I wasn't planning to. 6 months passed much faster than I ever expected. Not because every day was exciting, because ordinary days slowly became enough. Most mornings began exactly the same way. Coffee in my teacher's mug, a few quiet minutes on the balcony, watching the neighborhood wake up. The bakery opened before sunrise. The same motorcycles rolled past. The woman across the street still watered her plants every morning. The security guard still smiled and called out, "Good morning, Miss Linda." By then, I couldn't imagine mornings any other way. My little plant had doubled in size. I'd added curtains to the apartment, a bookshelf, a small lamp beside the sofa. Nothing expensive, nothing fancy, just enough little touches to make the apartment feel unmistakably mine. People often think feeling at home comes all at once. For me, it happened one tiny decision at a time. I still called my family every week, sometimes more than once. The grandchildren loved hearing about the monkeys they'd seen in pictures. They laughed every time I tried teaching them a new Cebuano word. One afternoon, my youngest grandson asked, "Grandma, are you coming home for Christmas?" I smiled, "Of course." Then he asked another question. "When are you coming back to Cebu?" I don't think he realized what he'd just said. He hadn't asked which place was home. In his mind, I had two, and somehow that felt exactly right. People still write to me sometimes. They ask if moving to the Philippines solved all my problems. I always smile when I read those messages, because no country can do that. I still miss Oregon. I still miss family dinners. I still wish my marriage had ended differently. Some mornings I even miss the rain. Life didn't become perfect. It simply became mine again. Sometimes I think back to that first night, standing on the balcony, airline website open, one finger resting over the button that would have taken me home. If I'd clicked it, none of this would have happened. I never would have known the woman at the bakery, or the security guard who remembered my name, or the quiet joy of drinking coffee while the city slowly came to life below my balcony. I never would have discovered that starting over doesn't happen in one brave moment. It happens through hundreds of tiny decisions. One walk, one conversation, one sunrise, one more day. People often tell me I'm brave. I appreciate the compliment, but bravery isn't really what brought me here. Fear came with me. It sat beside me on the airplane. It unpacked itself in my apartment. It stood with me on that balcony the first night. The difference was, I stopped letting fear make every decision. At 70 years old, I thought I was moving across the world. The truth is, I was slowly finding my way back to myself. Not the young woman I had once been. Not the wife I'd spent 42 years becoming. Simply Linda. And after everything life had given me, and everything it had taken away, that turned out to be more than enough. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that another life doesn't begin the day you board an airplane. It begins the moment you give yourself permission to believe that your story isn't over yet. Sometimes the greatest adventure isn't discovering a new country. Sometimes it's discovering there's still another version of yourself waiting to be found. And if you ask me, that journey is worth taking at any age.